Reading the Times for Saturday, February 1st, 2020. Republicans block impeachment witnesses, clearing path for Trump acquittal. The Senate brought President Trump to the brink of acquittal on Friday of charges that he abused his power and obstructed Congress as Republicans voted to block the consideration of new witnesses and documents in his impeachment trial and shut down a final push by Democrats to bolster their case for the president's removal. If the president is acquitted with no witnesses, no documents, the acquittal will have no value because Americans will know that this trial was not a real trial. Even as they prepared to vote against removing him, several Republicans challenged Mr. Trump's repeated assertions that he had done nothing wrong, saying they believed he had committed the main offense of which he was accused, withholding nearly $400 million in military aid to pressure Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. and other Democrats. The president had insisted that he did nothing wrong, calling a July telephone conversation in which he asked the president of Ukraine to investigate his political rivals perfect, and the impeachment inquiry a sham. For months, he has demanded that his allies deliver nothing less than an absolute defense of his actions. Trump told Bolton to help his Ukraine pressure campaign, book says. More than 2 months before he asked Ukraine president to investigate his political opponents, President Trump directed John R. Bolton, then his national security advisor, to help with his pressure campaign to extract damaging information on Democrats from Ukrainian officials, according to an unpublished manuscript by Mr. Bolton. Mr. Trump told Mr. Bolton to call Volodymyr Zelensky, who had recently won elections as president of Ukraine, to ensure Mr. Zelensky would meet with Mr. Giuliani, who was planning a trip to Ukraine to discuss the investigations that the president sought. In Mr. Bolton's account, asked about Mr. Bolton's account, Mr. Giuliani said, I think he's making some of it up. He's sure making it up. I wouldn't call it making it up, but he's acting like a real scumbag by never telling me that he objected once and then saying I was a time bomb or firecracker or something. The conversation that Mr. Bolton describes was separate from another one that Mr. Bolton wrote about, in which he observed Mr. Mulvaney and Mr. Trump talking on the phone with Mr. Giuliani about Ukraine matters. Once skeptical, Senate Republicans are all in on Trump. Senator Kelly Loeffler of Georgia, the newest member of the Senate through her recent appointment, attacked Senator Mitt Romney of Utah, her fellow Republican, on Twitter for trying to appease the left by backing the idea of witnesses. Bob Corker of Tennessee, the former Republican senator who spoke up against Mr. Trump on occasion and drew the president's ire, decided not to seek another term in 2018 and has been replaced by Senator Marsha Blackburn, a conservative former House member who has been biting in her criticism of the impeachment trial and the presentation by House Democrats. Not long ago, senators of both major parties always worked to accommodate fellow colleagues with different points of view to arrive at outcomes that would best serve the nation's interest, John Warner, a former senator from Virginia, said in a statement. That was John, not Marsha. Trump administration restricts entry into the U.S. from China. The government travel restrictions, which will take effect on Sunday evening, were announced by Alex Azar, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who declared that the coronavirus posed a public health emergency in the United States. The administration's actions will restrict all foreign nationals who have been to China in the past 14 days from entering the United States. Apple has closed one retail store in China and said traffic to its stores across China has decreased in recent days. In addition to the restrictions on foreign nationals traveling from China, the United States will begin funneling all flights from China to just a few airports, including Kennedy International in New York, O'Hare in Chicago, and San Francisco International. How chaos at chain pharmacies is putting patients at risk. Mistakes are going to be made and patients are going to be the ones suffering. State boards and associations in at least 24 states have heard from distraught pharmacists. Interviews and records show, while some doctors complain that pharmacies bombard them with requests to fill that patients have with requests to refills that patients have not asked for and should not receive. CVS says outreach to patients and doctors can help patients stay up to date on their medications and lead to lower costs and better health. Dr. Denby, who retired in December, said it was a bald-faced lie that patients had asked for medication, providing statements from patients saying as much. Capital in Trump's Middle East plan makes a joke of Palestinian aspirations. Like a monument to dashed hopes, an unfinished Palestinian parliament building stands derelict on a ridge in Abu Dis, an unimposing West Bank suburb of Jerusalem that the Trump administration has proposed as the capital of a future Palestinian state. At least 120,000 Palestinians live beyond the barrier, but still inside the Jerusalem city limits, so they can cling to their Jerusalem residency cards, which allow them to work and travel inside Israel. Like all Palestinians, I refuse what we call the American-Israeli agreement to take Jerusalem, she said. She last visited Jerusalem 3 years ago to pray during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, a visit that required a special permit from the Israeli authorities. Kenya's High Court delays national biometric ID program. Kenya's High Court on Thursday temporarily suspended the country's new national biometric identity program until the government enacts laws to protect the security of the data and prevent discrimination against minorities. The program, called the National Integrated Management System, was introduced last year and sought to collect personal and biometric data, including fingerprints, facial photographs, and residential addresses, from Kenya's population of almost 50 million. Civil rights groups say the program risks disenfranchising millions of people who already face systemic challenges getting the documents required to obtain biometric ID cards. From armed struggle to peaceful protest, a road still to travel. Why should we fight a people irrespective of their religion just to bring them into the sphere of Islam, even if they don't convert? There are many ways to pursue jihad peacefully, he said. The word jihad is not just taking a Kalishnikov, he said. The word jihad is wider in Islam. Media jihad, academic jihad, legal jihad, money jihad, think tanks jihad, politics jihad, diplomacy jihad. Fighting is just one part of it. After the Soviet Union withdrawal from Afghanistan, Mr. Anas returned to Algeria in 1990, but was detained. His relationship with Mr. Assam made him a person of extreme interest for the Algerian authorities, and after his release, began a life of precarious exile with his young family. Giuliani sought help for client in meeting with Ukraine official. The coincidence in timing between Klitschko's meeting with Giuliani and the developments in the governance of Kiev was striking, said Alexander Chachenko, a member of the Ukrainian parliament, whom Mr. Zelensky has been expected to nominate as Mr. Klitschko's replacement. Asked about the meeting with Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Klitschko, said, "I did not ask anyone for assistance. Mr. Klitschko said he has never had a business relationship with Mr. Giuliani," a claim contradicted by a Mr. Giuliani, who consulted for the former boxer's 2008 campaign. A Mr. Giuliani said that he had not formally represented Mr. Klitschko in years, even though I still advise him. But 2 days later, a Mr. Giuliani was speaking about Mr. Klitschko to Mr. Yermak in Madrid. A view of Brexit from the soccer field. There are immigrants from different corners of the world, transplanted Europeans, and players from across Britain. Portraits of the Brexit. 3 years after Britain voted to leave the European Union, dividing the nation as never before, it finally left on Friday. How far do the people think you meet playing football translates into your everyday politics, your everyday actions, your feelings toward other people? Some British voters said they favored leaving the bloc so that Britain can have more control over immigration and who is allowed to live and work in the country. Britons on Brexit, we've made a spectacle. We've made a spectacle of ourselves. The irony is that Brexit was all about taking back control, but we've never been so out of control. No one even knows what the reality of Brexit will look like. Since the 2016 referendum on Britain's membership of the Union, political discord has rippled through the country, sundering towns and cities and rupturing relationships among families and friends. We've made a spectacle of ourselves, squabbling over Brexit for years. We let down the vulnerable communities whose needs have been neglected because the government was paralyzed by Brexit. Ms. Shaw said, even within politics, have made me feel like the likelihood of cohesion within our country is out of the picture. And while our nation is ideally supposed to become more unified, when we faced with threats of division, the opposite has occurred. Oscar Redgrave, a 17-year-old student in Shrewsbury, Western England, who started a pro-European Union campaign group for young people, said one of the most worrying aspects of Brexit was how it had pushed racism and discrimination into the mainstream. At the stroke of Brexit, Britain steps guardedly into a new dawn. Some British commentators complained that the Europeans made a greater show of Britain's leaving, which they had opposed, than Britain did. As Mr. Johnson's influential advisor, Dominic Cummings, once put it, Britain can become the best place for those who want to invent the future. 3 years after Britain voted to leave. Oh, what the fuck? A repeater. Anyways, we'll see what this means. 3 years. Did I just read that? I don't think so. Anyway. 3 years after Britain voted to leave the European Union, dividing the nation as never before, it finally left on Friday night. Though the European Union is a far bigger economic entity, it is wary of allowing Britain to become a competitor with lighter regulations, which could undercut European producers. Taliban's continued attacks show limits of U.S. strategy in Afghanistan. The increase in violence occurred during a period at which President Trump tweeted, "The United States was hitting our enemy harder than at any time in the last 10 years. The number of attacks detailed in the quarterly report from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, a government watchdog formed in 2008, highlights once more the disparity between talking points on suppressing the Taliban and the reality on the ground. Despite a concerted bombing campaign and American and Afghan offensive ground operations, Taliban fighters are still able to attack at levels similar to a decade ago. The 2019 American military aircraft dropped 7,423 bombs and missiles, a record number since the Air Force began recording data in 2006, according to recently released Air Force documents. Ultimately, the Taliban want a complete withdrawal of American troops, while the Americans eventually want joint talks between the Taliban and other Afghans over power sharing in the government. Trump administration adds 6 countries to travel ban. The administration has argued that the ban, enacted in 2017 to restrict travel from Muslim-majority countries, is necessary to ensure that countries satisfy security requirements for travel into the United States or face restrictions until they do. The United States issued more than 7,920 immigrant visas to Nigerians in the 2018 fiscal year, the second most of any African country. Before the announcement on Friday, an American government official said the administration planned to add Nigeria and Tanzania to its list because the number of people coming from those countries on a visa who end up staying in the United States illegally. China targets the coronavirus and farmers pay a price. To battle the coronavirus outbreak spreading across China, the provincial government has ordered businesses except those necessary for daily life, such as utilities, pharmacies, and supermarkets, to close until February 10th. Many were already struggling with China's slowing economic growth and increased government meddling. Of course, China is hardly alone in punishing price gouging, and it won public praise for fining some pharmacies for raising prices of face masks, which are in short supply in China. Masks are on, games are canceled. Fear of coronavirus comes to U.S. colleges. At ASU, which has one of the largest student bodies in the country, students have been streaming into the campus health center in larger than usual numbers. 2 of the students, who are natives of Wuhan, have been rooming with each other instead of with American students, as originally planned. Dr. Stacy San Miguel, the Director of Medical Services at the University of California, San Diego Student Health Center, said students and others have been flocking to physicians for checkups. 195 quarantined in California after fleeing coronavirus epicenter. The United States government has imposed a 2-week federal quarantine on 195 people who were evacuated on Wednesday from Wuhan, China, to a California military base, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said on Friday, citing quarantines in Toronto during the SARS outbreak there in 2003. He said that most people being quarantined accept it as part of their civic responsibility to protect their community, once they understand the reasons. Last week, China took the extreme measure of halting public transit and imposing a quarantine on Wuhan, a city of 11 million people. U.S. strikes at leader of Qaeda in Yemen. A veteran of Qaeda's training camps in Afghanistan, Mr. al-Rimi, later returned to his native Yemen, where he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for plotting to kill the American ambassador there. Al-Rimi is an important target, probably more dangerous to Yemen and Saudi Arabia than for Americans, given the group's diminished capabilities during the Yemen war, he said. The strike against Mr. al-Rimi came at roughly the same time the American military unsuccessfully tried to kill a senior Iranian military official in Yemen, Abdul Reza Shalai. You can't fake those kinds of skills. Pete Buttigieg's charisma test. In his improbable journey to the upper reaches of the Democratic field in Iowa and New Hampshire, Mr. Buttigieg appears to have carved out his own category. He is a candidate of the ear, elevated by a baritone delivery belying his age, saying the things that sound about right in a moment when the least Trumpian notes sound especially good to Democrats. Supporters sometimes cite Mr. Buttigieg's biography before his personality, his sparkling academic credentials, his military service, his history-making potential as openly gay candidate. Miss Downs, the party's executive director in Polk County, Iowa, recalled a small reception before a candidate event last year, where Mr. Buttigieg's absence of presence, clipped answers, keeping to himself, left an impression. Iowa will be the first test case for the 2020 election security. The campaign eagerly promoted his hiring last summer, pointing out that it was the only Democratic campaign to have hired a chief information security officer. Many in the campaign saw Mr. Baccio's security measures as clumsy and cumbersome. One staff member complained that an attempt to install mobile management software briefly cut off access to email across the entire campaign. Our campaign has retained a new security firm and continues to be committed to digital security and protecting against cyber attacks, said Chris Meager, spokesman for the campaign. DNC rules change for Nevada debate could open door for Bloomberg. The edict from party officials, which some saw as a concession to Mr. Bloomberg, quickly reignited concerns among those who believe the DNC's shifting rules for the debates privileged some candidates and campaigns over others. We're thrilled that voters could soon have the chance to see Mike Bloomberg on this debate stage, hear his vision for the country, and see why he's the strongest candidate to defeat Donald Trump and bring our country together. Kevin Sheekey, Mr. Bloomberg's campaign manager, said in a statement, "Billionaires shouldn't be allowed to play by different rules on the debate stage, in our democracy or in our government." Former Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, the entrepreneur Andrew Young, the hedge fund billionaire Tom Steyer, each of whom qualified for next week's debate in New Hampshire, could still make the one that follows in Nevada by reaching the polling threshold of winning a delegate in the Iowa caucuses or in the New Hampshire primary. Bloomberg fueled his campaign with $200 million from his own fortune. Michael R. Bloomberg put more than $200 million of his personal fortune into his presidential campaign by the end of December, with overwhelming bulk of that sum going to a mammoth advertising campaign on television and online, according to Mr. Bloomberg's first campaign finance disclosure with the Federal Election Commission. Mr. Bloomberg's wealth financed a huge array of campaign expenditures, many unusual or unheard of for candidates of normal means, including millions of dollars in polling before Mr. Bloomberg even entered the race, $1.5 million for office space, about $700,000 for rental apartments for campaign staff, and nearly as much on travel by private jet. The report included $12 million in payments to Mr. Bloomberg's company, Bloomberg LP, that were listed as prepayments for campaign expenses. Klobuchar faces uproar over her role in black teenagers' murder conviction. In a telephone interview Friday night, Daniel Guerrero, a lawyer for Mr. Burrell, who has represented him since 2017, said that while he believed the authorities could have more rigorously followed up on leads and alibis, he did not think, based on his review, that Ms. Klobuchar had done anything specifically wrong. "I don't think she has much to do with the case," he said, noting that line prosecutors had handled it. Ms. Klobuchar ran her Hennepin County Attorney's Office from 1999 through 2006 and oversaw Mr. Burrell's first trial, conviction, and sentencing in 2003. The AP article also said that Ms. Klobuchar denied Mr. Burrell's request to go to his mother's funeral after she died in a car crash during the investigation. White House holds trafficking summit, but critics dismiss lack of dialogue. President Trump held what he called a summit on human trafficking at the White House on Friday and pledged his administration's commitment to combating it. According to Polaris, a nonprofit organization that operates the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline, 10,949 cases of human trafficking were reported in 2018, a 25% jump from the year before. Many of the policies promoted and adopted under this administration have not been beneficial and have been quite harmful to human trafficking survivors. Ms. Brugman said, noting that $13.5 million grant to provide housing for trafficking victims was held up without explanation after an initial funding announcement said the money could support non-citizens. Plans for Alabama's deadly prisons won't fix the horrors. After months of promising to fix Alabama's dangerously violent prison system, a panel appointed by the governor issued recommendations this week that would do little to address the underlying problems identified last year in a scathing Justice Department report, which documented prisoners being routinely assaulted and tortured, sometimes with the knowledge and even participation of prison guards. In 2011, the United States Supreme Court found that the state, in violation of the Eighth Amendment, and ordered it to reduce the prison population. Jeff Dunn, the state's corrections commissioner, said in a statement that his department was committed to transparency and would agree and look forward to working with the legislature on increased oversight. Alabama's prisons have deteriorated over decades as low pay for corrections officers and the growth of the prison population coincided with the expansion of a robust black market for contraband and drugs, sometimes aided and abetted by prison officials and employees. Alexander says convicting Trump would pour gasoline on cultural fires. Mr. Baker, who died in 2014, introduced Mr. Alexander to Mr. McConnell in 1969 when Mr. Alexander was an aide in the Nixon White House and Mr. McConnell was a legislative assistant to a Kentucky senator. Today, Mr. McConnell calls Mr. Alexander my best friend in the Senate. But Mr. Alexander said he did not give Mr. McConnell, whom he described aptly as a person of few words, advance notice of his vote. He's not looking out to be on the front edge of it. Another close friend, Tom Ingram, who ran Mr. Alexander's Senate races and served as his chief of staff, said he was not surprised by Mr. Alexander's decision. Despite evidence, Republicans rallied behind Trump. This was their reasoning. The Senate voted on Friday nearly along party lines to block additional witnesses and evidence in President Trump's impeachment trial, effectively accelerating the proceedings toward a final vote, which is expected to be held Wednesday. Even before votes were cast Friday, a number of top Republicans came forward with statements rejecting the notion that the president should be convicted and removed, despite evidence laid out in recent weeks by House impeachment managers. While some lamented the partisan tenor of the proceeding, which they say threw the fairness of the trial in doubt, others said their decisions were based on a stronger conviction. Even if the president did everything the House managers described, his actions and alleged wrongdoing still do not justify removal from office. The Trump hotel patrons relish impeachment finale. Never settle, read the screen on the cash register, the slogan of the Trump Hotel's brand, and in a way, the motto for Mr. Trump himself throughout the impeachment saga. Mr. Hyde, who says he's running for a House seat in Connecticut, still hangs at the hotel when he's in Washington, as it offers him opportunity to network with key players in the Trump administration, or at least circle of people trying to influence Mr. Trump. Waste of time and taxpayer money. Mr. Trump, the Trump family, has announced that it may sell the Washington Hotel, which opened in late 2006 and quickly became one of the top sources of revenue for the Trump organization. Amid Trump's trial, Pompeo visited Ukraine. Here's how it went. Mr. Pompeo said on Friday that the United States under President Trump has been the world's fiercest defender of Ukraine's sovereignty. Aliana Germanchuk, a director of the New Europe Center in Kiev, a research group, welcomed the move by Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Zelensky to reaffirm American aid for Ukraine, including military support, but said there are still major concerns. A reporter, Mary Louise Kelly, a veteran of national security correspondence, said that after she had asked about Ukraine, Mr. Pompeo shouted at her and asked her to locate Ukraine on an unmarked map. As the Secretary of State and CIA Director Mike Pompeo had every opportunity to put his mark on Russian and Ukraine policy, said Andrew S. Weiss, a former American official who worked on Russia and Ukraine and is now at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Diplomat at center of Trump impeachment trial retires from State Department. The American ambassador, whose abrupt recall from Ukraine helped lead to President Trump's impeachment, has retired from the State Department. A person familiar with her plans confirmed on Friday, on a July 25th telephone call with President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, Mr. Trump described Ms. Yovanovitch as bad news and said ominously, she's going to go through some things. She possibly already had. Text messages between Mr. Trump's personal lawyer, Rudolph W. Giuliani, and his associates that were released publicly earlier this month indicated that Ms. Yovanovitch was under surveillance while still in Kiev, a claim that the State Department and Ukraine security officials are investigating. At its heart was whether Mr. Trump could be held liable for appearing to withhold $391 million in security aid from Ukraine, money that Congress had already approved, until Mr. Zelensky announced an investigation into a company that had employed Hunter Biden, son of former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., who is seeking the Democratic nomination to run against Mr. Trump. Teens find a big loophole in the new flavored vaping ban. If you're vaping, he said, you're going to gradually want a cigarette. Bennett said he believes teenagers would stop vaping if the flavors were not available. Cheap, accessible, fruit-flavored vaping devices are tailor-made to ensnare children and teens. President Trump needs to grow spine and enact real flavor ban he promised, not this loophole-ridden version that was tailor-made to appease the vaping industry. The federal government's 2019 Youth Tobacco Survey, released by the FDA and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, found that a quarter of the nation's high school students reported vaping within the previous 30 days, up from 20.7% the previous year and 11.7% in 2016. Though some of them had also vaped nicotine, only a small portion said they had vaped only nicotine. Cuomo's bad medicine on Medicaid. For years, New York State had operated one of the most generous Medicaid programs in the country, a point of pride in a state with a long tradition of investing in the social safety net. That's not unusual in New York, where Albany relies on New York City's tax base to fund the bulk of the state services from education to commuter rails. To get New Yorkers' Medicaid program back on track, a group will need to take a hard look at spending on non-medical services like cooking and bathing for homebound New Yorkers. Bernie Sanders can't win. A Bernie Sanders rally is a hit from the same pipe. Screw those greedy billionaire bastards. Sanders has passion going for him. Know what will get the Trump demagogue factory working at full throttle is the central message of the Sanders campaign, that the United States needs a political revolution. Your grandchildren will do a similar search for Bernie Sanders when they wonder how Donald Trump won a second term. Bernie's angry bros. Barbara Boxer makes no words when it comes to describing the people usually known as the Bernie Bro, a subset of Bernie Sanders supporters who hope to take over the Democratic Party and remake it in their image. You can be angry about the unfairness of the world, but this becomes a personal, deep-seated anger at anyone who doesn't exactly say what you want to hear. I ran into Boxer earlier this week and got into a talking about a superb report by the Times by my colleague Matt Flegenheimer, Rebecca R. Ruiz, and Nellie Bowles. Bernie Sanders and his internet army. The piece briefly mentions a 2016 incident in which Boxer went to Nevada to try to unify the party after Hillary Clinton defeated Bernie Sanders in the state's caucus. No wonder nearly half of Sanders' supporters won't commit to or are unsure about voting for the Democratic nominee in the event it isn't Bernie. according to a recent poll. Requiem for a Dream. Britain ceased equating Europe with scourges like intellectuals, rabies, and garlic, as it had in my childhood. Britain had given up its colonies and found a new identity in association with Europe, or so it seemed flickeringly. Europe helped Britain grow bigger and more open and more prosperous. How the Iowa caucuses work. During the caucus vote, there's a first round where people walk around a large room and stand in their candidate's corner. If there are 3 delegates and 35 people in your precinct, how many people do you need in your candidate's group to gain one of Iowa's 41 delegate votes? Mr. Martinez pulled out his phone to do a calculation while reassuring us that when the real caucus day came, the precinct captains would check the numbers. If you don't know the math of how many voters each candidate needs to gain a delegate's vote, and you don't know which candidate you want, it's extremely difficult to be strategic. The impeachment trial nears a final vote. The vote is in. No witnesses, no evidence. I'm ashamed to call myself an American. I don't know what to do with my rage, my pain, my utter disgust with the partisan politics that led to this disgraceful event. This is a mockery of a trial. The consequences are going to taint the rule of law and the process of checks and balances for the rest of time. But in this country, there's something I can do. I'm going to work even harder to rid this country of Donald Trump. I will turn my rage into a commitment to change the awful direction this country has taken. That I can do. As an American, I can say what I believe. I can vote. And so can the vast majority of Americans who wanted witnesses and evidence. We can all vote. We can all speak out against this terrible corruption. And I believe we will. The impeachment trial was a farce. By foregoing the call of witnesses, the Republican Party showed an utter disdain for the American people. Our country needs an informed citizenry composed of people who possess confidence in their elected officials. Shame on every senator who voted to withhold information from us and to allow this mockery of a trial to exist. The Republican Party sold its soul on Friday. Watching the Republican senators at the impeachment trial, I can't help thinking that line from W.S. Gilbert. I always voted at my party's call, and I never thought of thinking for myself at all. The parsing of words by Republicans has become so creative that it's stunning. Senator Lamar Alexander said in a statement on Thursday, President Trump's call to the president of Ukraine was inappropriate. Calling your girlfriend to tell her the sweater she wore today made her look fat. That's inappropriate. A call by the president to a foreign leader to say that he would withhold appropriated funds until the leader investigated his opponent? That's extortion. Does Iowa deserve its leading role? There are candidates for national office, but these are candidates for national office, not state office. And there are ludicrous inconsistencies among states' primary election rules. Further, why should primary debates be serialized state by state at all? There was once a reason, but today's rapid travel and communication is anachronistic. David Leonhardt is correct when he argues that the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary afford those two states an unfair and disproportionate amount of influence in the presidential nomination process. Battle lines quickly form over radical property tax proposal. Carrie Bitch, a spokeswoman for Carl E. Heastie, the Assembly Speaker, said the plan was a first step in the city coming up with a more fair and equitable property tax structure. The seemingly reluctance to embrace such far-reaching changes to the property tax system is predictable, especially to those who have fought for years to change the system. The City Commission, which was created in 2018 by Mr. de Blasio and Corey Johnson, the City Council Speaker, recommended eliminating the cap on how much a property's assessed value can grow each year, a cap that helped keep taxes low even as property markets' values soared. Teachers, social workers, retirees. Now his home has a market value of $4.63 million, but his property taxes have remained low at about $12,000 a year. because of the cap placed on how much residential property taxes can be increased each year. New York is urged to consider surge pricing for taxis. New York City should consider allowing yellow cabs to use some of the same strategies as ride-hailing companies Uber and Lyft, including so-called surge pricing, which, when demand is high, a government panel is set to recommend. The panel will also recommend that the city consider buying back medallions from people who bought them at city auctions, according to the draft. We must consider all options when determining ways to save the taxi medallion industry, said Mr. Rodriguez, the panel co-chairman. Former actress testifies in graphic detail how Weinstein raped her. On cross-examination, Mr. Weinstein's lawyer, Donna Rotono, suggested that Miss Mann had not been raped but had consented to the sex to advance her career. Within the month, they met again at the Montage Hotel in Beverly Hills, where the producer told Miss Mann and a friend they would make perfect leads in the film Vampire Academy. He invited them to his hotel suite to review the scripts, but when Miss Mann expressed concern, he said, I'm a harmless old man. Once in the suite, Miss Mann said Mr. Weinstein separated her from her friend, pulled her into a bedroom, shut the door, told her to get on the bed, and performed oral sex on her. Miss Mann began questioning Mr. Weinstein about why he had a room in the hotel, since he had an apartment in Manhattan. No more doggies in the window. New York may ban retail pet sales. The bill would apply to the 80 or so licensed pet stores, businesses in the state, not to breeders who sell the animals directly. Just 4% of dogs are purchased at pet stores every year, according to a biannual survey by the American Pet Products Association. Mike Bober, President and Chief Executive Officer for the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Council, said the bill in New York was an unwise and unproven reaction to well-intended animal health and safety concerns. Sales bans failed to distinguish between those who breed responsibly and those who put profits before pet care. He said in a statement, "Pregnant woman is strangled and pushed out of the car." Mr. Philp and Miss Walton were at the boy's parents, according to court documents. A friend of Miss Walton's, Eva Salazar Fierro, said that Miss Walton had been in a very toxic relationship with an on-again, off-again boyfriend, whom Miss Fierro knew as Cal. Miss Fierro, who said she had been Miss Walton's supervisor at a retail job at Century 21 and Sunglasses Hut in Manhattan, starting in 2013, recalled that Miss Walton would fall out of touch with friends and colleagues for months at a time because of how possessive her boyfriend was. Miss Walton, Mr. Fierro said, indicates that her boyfriend had gotten mad and pushed her. Is South Bend a prosperous college town or a struggling Rust Belt city? South Bend is not a college town, not in any way, shape, or form, said Richard Price, a historian at Notre Dame, who has lived in South Bend for 24 years. In South Bend, the Studebaker car manufacturer had been more central to the city's identity over the last century than Notre Dame has ever been. Judith Fox, a law professor who does legal aid work with poor residents in the city, recalls that tongue-in-cheek joke when she was recruited at Notre Dame 35 years ago. The cost of living in South Bend is low. Why Google backtracked on its new search results look. A couple of weeks ago, when Dan Scher was searching on Google for information about butchering meats, he did something he had avoided for 20 years. He unknowingly clicked on an ad. Mr. Scher, a consultant who helps companies manage where they appear in Google searches, had always thought it was easy to distinguish between paid search results and unpaid links. Google said that in January, it was eventually stripping third-party trackers or cookies from its Chrome browsers, a decision that is described as an effort to build a more private web. But the American Association of Advertising Agencies and the Association of National Advertisers quickly complained in an open letter that removing cookies could choke off the economic oxygen from advertising that startups and emerging companies need to survive. The reaction to the recent search page changes was so negative that Google took the rare step of reversing some of the design changes last week. Laura Levin, a Google spokeswoman, said in a statement that the recent design changes mirrored a new look in the the company introduced for search results on mobile phones in May. The company tested the new look on desktop searches, and the results were positive, she said, but it decided to make some changes in response to feedback from users. Alphabet, Google's parent company, is expected to report next week that annual revenue topped $150 billion in 2019. The future of BuzzFeed, win or lull? BuzzFeed now has growing commerce business that includes branded cookware at Walmart and an affiliate division that brings in money anytime a reader buys something from an online store when coming from a link in a BuzzFeed article. We want to break news and be fearless and stand up to power and do all the other things that define what BuzzFeed News is. The addition of a robust news division lent BuzzFeed prestige, but questions swirled around the effort as it got started in 2011, about 5 years after the site went live. BuzzFeed appeared to acknowledge the mixed brand message in 2018, when it moved the news articles to a new web address, BuzzFeedNews.com. CBS replaces its top executive as dust settles on Viacom merger. Joe Iannello, a 22-year veteran of the network who was promoted last year to chairman and chief executive officer, will leave the company. Mr. Cheeks, whose former title will be president and chief executive officer of CBS Entertainment Group, said in a statement he was incredibly honored to join the network. Mr. Bakish had also installed top CBS executives into the new management team, including Ray Hopkins, who heads the distribution, and Mark DeBevoy, the leading digital executive for the combined company. Richard Plepler and Josh Tyrangiel may revive their HBO act for Apple. Richard Plepler is closing in on a deal with former Vice media executive Josh Tyrangiel to join his new production company, Eden Studios, according to two people with knowledge of discussions. Mr. Plepler, the former chief executive of HBO, signed a 5-year deal late last year to make a series of documentaries and feature films exclusively for Apple TV+, the streaming platform that started in November. Mr. Tyrangiel is likely to focus on documentaries and current events programming if a deal is reached, the People said. In talks on taxing tech companies, it's America versus the world. Some 130 countries are engaged in the discussions through the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that are trying to set new rules for taxing multinational companies in an increasingly digital economy. Countries like France and Britain have approved so-called digital taxes that hit large tech companies like Google and Amazon that have large online footprints in their countries but face little tax liability because their physical operations are concentrated elsewhere. Pascal Saint-Amans, director of the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration, told reporters on Friday that for a large spectrum of countries, the American position would make any agreement difficult or impossible. Phone hacks can happen to anyone. Here's how to protect yourself. The mobile phone belonging to Jeff Bezos, founder and chief executive of Amazon, was allegedly hacked when he clicked a video sent through WhatsApp, essentially turning over control of his phone and all of its contents to the hackers. Hackers are using more surreptitious ways to gain access to people's financial lives and threaten their wealth. It's not so much the complexity of the attacks that's a problem. It's the ease with which hackers can gain access to someone's phone and life. Airbus pays $4 billion to settle corruption in court. Airbus will pay $4 billion in fines to settle a lengthy corruption investigation, a French court announced Friday, removing a legal cloud over the world's largest plane maker as it seeks to keep ahead of its rival Boeing after the grounding of Boeing's 737 MAX plane. The settlement with authorities in France, Britain, and the United States closes 4 years of investigations into accusations that Airbus, between 2004 and 2016, used intermediaries to bribe public officials in numerous countries to buy its planes and satellites. Medium-haul Airbus planes that could be alternatives to the MAX were already backed up in production because of strong demand from airlines, he said in an interview. Many adults are helping their parents financially despite strain. More than a quarter of the adults who provided financial help to the parents said it had placed a high level of financial strain on their family. 19% of those with adult children and aging parents said they were helping both financially. If you decide you can help financially, be clear about how much you can provide and what the money is to be used for, so the boundaries are established up front, said Julie Forth, a financial planner in Windham, New Hampshire. If there isn't much extra money to spare, but you are determined to help, you may have to cut back in some way, say postpone buying a new car, to free up that cash. Why it's so hard to make an endowment more socially responsible. Over the past year, the school's board had an assignment, the Sewanee students' research task that professionals could handle much more quickly. E. Douglas Williams, the school's treasurer, asked to meet Mr. McCoy and another student, Jackson Campbell, early last year. Given the lack of progress so far, the students have started to wonder whether the school is running out the clock. Church of England devises an index for climate-conscious investing. The Church of England Pensions Board, which manages £2.8 billion, this week announced an index that rewards companies working to curb their carbon dioxide emissions in line with the targets of the 2015 Paris Agreement, and bars companies that are perceived as environmental laggards. Europe's largest oil company, Royal Dutch Shell, which has worked closely with the Church of England in developing ambitious targets for reducing its carbon dioxide emissions, is included, as is Repsol, the Spanish oil company, which has also announced far-reaching goals. The Church of England's new index, which is currently for institutional investors, is trying to use the London School of Economics data to give investors exposure to companies that are positioned to perform well in the future on climate matters. And that has been Reading the Times for Saturday, February 1st, 2020.